Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another Oxford Sparks live Q&A, which is part of our Science at Home campaign. If you're new here, then I'd strongly encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you can keep up to date with all the latest goings on at Oxford Sparks, including live events like this. And we have a brand new animation launching on Thursday, so you can be kept up to date with that as well. You can also follow us on social media. We're at Oxford Sparks on Twitter, or you can find us on Facebook and Instagram as well. And it's just a great way to keep up to date with everything going on science-wise at the University of Oxford. So today I am delighted to be joined by not just one, but 4 scientists from the Plant Sciences Department here at Oxford. They are forest scientists, and so I'm excited to be talking about everything to do with trees, woods, forests, genetics, conservation today. Tons to get through, so we'll see what we can do in the next 40 minutes or so. We are live, so firstly I'd ask you to bear with us because, these things can be temperamental, and with 4 scientists then there might be a couple of glitches. If there are any problems, just pop them in the chat box. And speaking of which, one of the great things about this being live is that you can ask your questions, and I strongly encourage you to do so. So if something that one of our scientists is chatting about piques your interest, then please do ask about it. And if you just want to know more about science in general or how they got into their field, then we really welcome those questions as well. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our 4 scientists today. We have Dr. Hayley Toomas, Henry Hung, Laura Gilardin Calvo, and Barley Rose Collier Harris. So good afternoon, all of you.
Hi.
Hi. It's
good afternoon.
Great to have you here. So I guess the best place to start, seeing as there are 4 of you, is if you could just tell us a little bit about which aspect of forest science it is that you research. Then we'll be able to direct questions a little bit better when those start coming in. So maybe Hayley, shall we start with you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. So I study tree genetics, which means that I look at different aspects of genetics with trees. And this is just because genetics provide a ton of information that is really useful to conservation and management.
Thanks. Shall we go to Laura?
Yeah, my research is about investigating the genetic diversity of different forests, which are transforming into a continuous cover forestry management system from trees plantations, which are aiming to produce timber production.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm working around my screen. Let's go to Barley.
Hi, so I look at Sitka spruce, which is one type of tree that's grown in the UK, and I'm looking at genetic variation with regards to insect attack. So working out how much different insects attack it and why that is, maybe.
Interesting. So for those of you who have questions on the more zoology side about insects, then Barley is the person you want to be asking. And Henry?
I research on these fascinating trees called rosewood in Southeast Asia, and my research hopes to incorporate climate models and genomic data to help us inform the best way to conserve and restore these species.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, a fantastic range of subjects that you're studied, and we can obviously see some of the links between you, but yeah, also the diversity, so that's fantastic. Maybe I'll just start with a very general fun question, which is like, what do you love most about forests? There must have been something that attracted you to this subject, and yeah, we'll start off with that. And as I say, if you're watching, please do chip in and ask questions, and you can really help to steer the conversation. Yeah, we needn't sort of ask all of you every question, but this is a fun one. So should we just go again in the same order? Would that suit?
Yeah, that works. So I love forests because of kind of like the feel that you get when you walk through them. So it's kind of like walking through an old city, a lot like Oxford. So you look around, you see all these really old buildings, and you can think about like how many things have happened since these buildings were built like hundreds of years ago. And forests are kind of the same way because these trees are decades to hundreds of years old. And so I just love thinking about like how much this forest has seen, how many different people have like stood beside this tree before. Yeah, they're basically just like the most ancient city that you've ever been in.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much. So Laura?
So, as I am a forest engineer, for me, forest, like to be able to work in the forest and to investigate about genetic diversity or the genetic structure of different species, it's amazing because just the step of doing the field work, for example, is really, really nice to be walking through the forest, not just because you want to walk, because you want to know something else about it. So yeah, I think that's the most thing that I like about forest.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And I'm sure I'm not alone in just really enjoying a walk in the woods. I think particularly recently during lockdown, I'm really fortunate to live close to some wooded areas. And there are lots of studies, I think I'm right in saying, that show how good it is for your mental health to be in environments like this. So yeah, I can totally see that. Brilliant. So Barley Rose.
So for me, forestry, because I got into plants, so I've always studied plant science. That's what I did at my undergrad, and then studying forestry is just a way to study like the biggest and oldest plants. So the work I do in forest science takes everything that I learn in plant science and makes it bigger and more difficult, because trees are in general bigger and more difficult than other plants.
That's great. That's great. That's a fantastic answer. And I'm sure a lot of people watching will be on board with you. There's just something about plants. Whenever we produce plant content at Oxford Sparks, people love it. There's a lot of green-fingered people out there. And yeah, I think when you go for a walk, it just looks like all these trees have stories. And so I'm pretty envious that you get to explore those. Brilliant. Finally, Henry.
So I was born and nurtured in Hong Kong, so I actually grew up in another type of forest. It's the urban forest. And during my undergrad, I actually, one of my projects is to look at some biomechanics of trees in the city. And if you know, Hong Kong is very coastal, which means we got hit by typhoons all the time. But these trees are actually super important in cities to dissipate these wind energy during these hazardous seasons. So I just love how trees and forests in general are actually so connected with us. They're not something like just in the nature, in a textbook, but they are really beneficial in our well-being and in our society as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And in fact, my next question that I was going to ask was why are forests so important? So I guess that brings us on really nicely. You've spoken about the importance in the particular area where you're from. What would you say are some of the other reasons that forests are so important for us? And this doesn't just have to be Henry.
Forests are important to us. I guess the first thing I would think about is biodiversity, like especially tropical rainforest. Forests just harbor so much biodiversity of the world. It provides food, it provides shelters for lots of organisms. Sorry about the car sounds outside. Food and shelter to our to many organisms in the world, and they are also the primary producers which capture the energy, enabling these energy in the forest, in the ecosystem. So it's really the starting point, and shall I say the mother of everything, every biological organisms in these landscapes and habitats. So I think they are super important to our world and to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, don't they say sort of rainforests are the lungs of the planet? And it's a nice phrase, I think, to sum up just how important they are and for all the reasons you said. Anyone else want to chip in about anything different about why forests are important? Barley?
Lovely than Henry's answer. The species I work on is really commercially important as well. So Citrus Boost is the third biggest crop in the UK by land area. So of all of the things that we grow, all the wheat, the corn, the sweet potatoes, whatever it is that we're growing, the third biggest crop by the amount of space they take up is Citrus Boost. And that's because it's so important for timber production, for paper production, and it contributes about £1 billion a year to the UK economy. So we think about them as a very natural resource, but that doesn't mean that they're not also working for us financially and working for us in like catering for all of our day-to-day consumable needs. And I think ideally we'll find a way to tie those two things together. So to make sure that we are both supporting ourselves commercially while also like supporting the environment and making sure that the world is habitable.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really important point, and I'm glad you brought it up because you do have to think about all of these different aspects. And yeah, those stats and figures that you gave there are really impressive. So yeah, absolutely, really important to remember. So I guess, unfortunately, after having just heard how important and brilliant all these forests are, they are facing threats, and that's something that I guess some of you are working on. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about some of the specific threats that either forests in general or your specific species are facing?
Yeah, so I'll start off. And so it's not something that I'm working on at the moment, but it's something that is unsurprisingly also affecting forests, which is climate change.
Yeah.
And so, believe it or not, when temperatures heat up, trees don't always love that. I mean, up to a certain point, they might like it, but I mean, you have to think about it kind of like how we are. I mean, if it's nice and 20 degrees outside, we're able to do a whole bunch of things and we're loving it. We're going for long walks. But when it gets up to 40, we're like, oh my goodness, no, I'm just going to sit down all day. And trees are kind of the same way. Like, yeah, they might be loving it once it gets a little bit warm and sunny, but they do reach a tipping point.
Yeah.
And we are starting to see mortality as well as just declines in growth. So climate change is probably the biggest one for me.
Yeah.
But there are other side effects other than temperature, which I think we can also speak to.
Yeah, it's just before I asked someone else, I know Henry also works on the effects of climate change. Is it particular forests, sort of in particular areas of the planet, that we're seeing these effects most strongly? Like, is it high latitudes that are seeing the effects worst?
So it would be some of the higher latitudes. Yeah, the boreal forests, those that are more accustomed to it being cooler and wetter are obviously going to dislike the warmer, drier temperatures the most.
And I guess, I mean, I'm more used to working on animal species, and even though it's a slow process, animals can gradually move, whereas the trees can't. So
well, they can move a bit, but it's not like how we would think of trees moving. And they move obviously a lot more slowly. And so, I mean, we're not talking about ants here. They're not getting up and walking down the road, but a tree can move by producing their seeds, and the seeds will then get carried a little bit further. And if they land in an area that before maybe was too cool for them to live before, but now it's warmer, then they can start growing there. And so their range does shift slowly, which is how trees do move, but it's so much slower than animals.
I'm so sorry, I just dropped out slightly there. So if I looked strange, that's why. But I did catch most of what you were saying, so thank you for that. Henry, did you want to add anything about the effects of climate change?
Well, I'm actually about to start another threat that trees are facing, but I can come back to climate change later. But I think a great threat to forest, back to your original question, another important point is really still our overexploitation of these natural resources. So one thing to highlight about the species I'm working on, the rosewoods or the scientific name Baubergia, according to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes, if I remember the name correctly, it actually accounts for at least 35% of the total illegal wildlife seizure, which is actually more than summed up by the animal product, and which is like shocking. And Southeast Asia and also Madagascar are two big exporting countries of these valuable timber. And people want to exploit this timber because they want to turn them into really luxury furniture. They are very special of their smell, their color, and their texture. So people are fond of them, but unsustainable or unmanaged exploitation of these timber in the natural populations just make the regeneration in the nature not possible. They are just too slow to regenerate compared to the hunting or harvesting rate. So it's really a great danger that if we don't manage these harvesting well, then we are losing these valuable species in the wild. And of course, with climate change, well, although many aspects of climate change are still uncertain, we are still facing different possible emission scenario in the future. But for sure, climate change is affecting every species and drawing the species out of their comfort zone, let's say, or the adapted environment, adapted climate, and making them less and less easy to survival in the wild. And if the populations are further down because of overexploitation or human disturbances, then climate change's effect will be even greater.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to hear you talk about all of those different threats, and yeah, it's a pretty difficult thing to hear about actually, but obviously really important. And I must just apologize again if I didn't quite make sense for a second because I did drop out. Just, you're doing a great job, so just continue talking. Has anyone else, Bali or Lara, got anything to add about threats? Well, I think we've covered a few. If not, we shall move on. So I guess, you know, in your lab, you're looking at genetics, and that's not something that we've spoken a great deal about yet. So why is studying genetics so important in forest science? Like, what can you learn from that? Maybe we'll go with Bali or Lara, just as we haven't heard so much from you yet, and I want to give everyone a fair chance.
From my perspective, it links on a bit to what Hayley was talking about with range shift earlier. So we see this range shift not only in tree species that they used to live generally further south and then they move further north to follow the cooler temperatures, but other things move as well. And what I'm studying is insects. And as it gets warmer, insects reproduce a lot faster and they eat a lot more. So from my perspective, there are a couple of ways that we can deal with this increased insect activity. And one way is we can just pump forests full of pesticides, and that will solve that problem. But that then obviously has other effects where you see diminished bee populations and you get poisoning of rivers and streams, and like the whole food chain can get contaminated by these pesticides. So then what I'm looking at with genetics is if we can find a genetic basis to resistance. So in the same way that all people are the same species, but we still have lots of differences, and some of us might be more or less susceptible to illnesses. With insects, it's kind of the same. So trees might be more or less susceptible to insect attack. So they might have thicker bark, or they might produce different chemicals that smell different. But one way that we can find that out is by genetics. So we can see which trees get eaten more, and then we can look at their genes and we can find out what the underlying cause is. And then that means in future, before we plant them out, we can test them and find out if they're going to be more resistant or less resistant. So we can use genetics in that way as like a field of study, but we can then have this very practical application, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's super interesting. Yeah, fantastic. Did you want to add anything, Lara?
In my case, I am studying non-native species here in the UK. So, and there are old plantations that we don't know exactly the seed source. So we study the genetic diversity because maybe these plantations hold a lower genetic diversity than a natural forest. So doing this and also investigating the genetic diversity of the natural regeneration of these plantations, we can see how gene pool is transferred between generations, and see if they have enough genetic diversity, they will be able to maybe adapt better to these threats that climate change will produce or is producing already.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I just want to say we have had a question in from Angelina, so thank you very much. Just before we ask that one, Hayley, did you have a few slides that you wanted to show at this point?
Yes, I did, because so genetics are my bread and butter, specifically genetic diversity, which is something that we are all somewhat looking at. So let me see if Skype will actually let me do this.
We have to do some technical jiggery pokery, but it looks like that should be working to me.
Okay, see. So when we're looking at genetics, we'll pretend here that we have two different forests, and this is incredibly simplified, but we have one that would have a lot of different genetic variants. So this would be looking at different And so they're represented here by different colors. And then we have another forest that is just one single genetic variant. So it has no genetic diversity. And so let's say we have a disturbance come through. So we'll say first we have beetles come through, which Barley will like because that is what she looks at, is insects coming through. And this is an increasing problem under climate change. Okay, so let's say we have an insect come through, and most of our trees do have those wonderful resistance genes that Barley Rose was talking about, but turns out our green and our blue genes don't. And so right now it looks like our low genetic diversity forest is doing fine. And so if you were a manager, you'd be like, oh, that one's doing fine. We'll let it be if you don't know what's going on genetically. But now let's say we also have a drought come through, one of these hot, dry droughts that we're going to get more and more of under climate change. And it turns out that now our orange gene variant doesn't have our drought resistant gene. Something else that's studied in our lab, but now we're seeing them die out. And so this could be something that happens tomorrow, or it could happen 5 years down the line. And this is why genetic diversity is so important and why studying genetics is so important, because on the surface, these forests look like they're both pretty healthy. In fact, the one with really low genetic diversity looks like it's healthier until we have a disturbance come in. And so it's just my little example of why genetic diversity is important.
No, I love it. Thanks so much for preparing that. I do love explain a lot with, and yeah, it shows just how important it is. So yeah, thank you so much for doing that. So I said we had a question. Angelina says that just today she watched a video about people exploring the option of building homes with wood instead of concrete, and she wonders how long does it actually take to build a sustainable forest. So I don't know who feels best. Maybe Barley Rose. Would you be able to answer that first?
So I think what Angela's referring to here is a forest where you've got you're cutting it down, but you're replanting it at the same rate. So what's done with Sitka at the moment is that it's on about a 30-year timescale. So a farmer will own 10 fields, let's say, for example, and in the first year, 2 will be planted, and then they'll wait 5 years, and then they'll plant another 2, etc., etc. And then every 30 years, they're cutting down whichever trees are 30 years old. So every year, you're planting some and cutting some down. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is what Laura's looking into, which is continuous cover forestry. So that's a bit more where you let it regrow itself. And so I'll hand over to Laura to explain a bit more about continuous cover forestry.
So there are different system managements to manage forests, and one is clear felling, which is what Barley Rose, I think she was talking. Like you plant and then you replant, you cut and replant, and there are many others in which you prefer to have natural regeneration, and you can select specific trees. So you are cutting so little in comparison, and you are opening spaces, so you are allowed to have natural regeneration and also produce timber to make houses with wood or many other services. So the time is it depends in which stage you are, or in which kind of forest, the species. It could be, I don't know, I can't say a number, but with trees, times is, maybe we can talk about 50 years, 60 years, or 100. So yeah, the timeline is huge.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. I think you've answered the question fantastically. So thank you for sending that in. And we do love questions, so keep passing them on. I can't believe we've actually already been talking for almost half an hour. But yeah, as long as you guys are happy to hang around a bit longer, it'd be great to hear a bit more. So one of the interesting things we were chatting about earlier was you suggested that there might be a way for people not in academia to get involved in forest science, because I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this who think, oh, I love forests, and we've been hearing about the threats and why they're so important. So what exactly do you mean by that? How can people get involved who aren't in science?
So I, for example, work with an industry partner. So my PhD is funded and a quarter of my funding comes from industry. And the company I work with produces saplings and seed, which they have tested to make sure that they're going to be trees that grow really tall. But there are lots of people who work for that company who work in a whole range of roles. So some of them work in the nursery, planting up the trees. Some of them work in a more like PR front, where they'll be working with forestry, but they're going out and selling the saplings and like talking to other farmers. So from an industry point of view, there are lots of different jobs you can do, from like finance and marketing through to like on the ground getting your hands dirty in the mud. But then there's also the farming side of it. So obviously my company then is selling to farmers. So if you own land or you can work for a farmer to go around and manage forests, and to make sure that like you're monitoring if there are insect attacks, that has to be like noted. If like trees are suffering for various reasons, like if there's been a really bad drought, then that all needs to be noted down, because that's all like important information from that perspective. But maybe Henry could talk more about like working in natural forests, or Hayley actually, because I know you've done some more natural stuff previously, about like how you could get into conservation.
Hear you in the chat. It's all right. I think we've now sorted it. I'm so sorry. Would you mind just saying that bit again?
Yeah. Start from the beginning. Vote. Vote for people that care about forest science. So that's the biggest thing that you can probably do individually is stay informed. Stay informed about what's going on politically with forest science, because so much, as Henry said, comes down to what's being destroyed, and what's being saved. And so go beyond just, oh, this is the politician that says they're going to plant 1 million trees, but also think about where they're saying they're going to plant them and what they're going to plant with. Are they going to use native species or non-natives? Are they going to use species that they've looked into, like, or are they going to plant out something that's genetically identical? And we already talked about the issues with that. So stay informed, and if you are of voting age, think about that when you go and cast your vote.
I fully agree with what Hayley had. As well, I myself, I work on science about forest conservation. But actually, my project is really close linked with 5 governments in the region in Southeast Asia, and I fully understand like how important it is to get policymakers informed of the best science and make sure their strategies, their conservation management is informed by good science, by evidence, and that way it leads to really sustainable forests. Well, if these all sounds too far-fetched from our audience, I will just give one really simple tip I think everyone can follow. It's to, as I said earlier, that overexploitation is a threat, and we want to use sustainable forest products. One thing you can do is to look for accreditations. For example, that tree products that are accredited by FSC, for example, that you know that these final products are sourced from sustainably managed forest, which means there's no pressure on the natural populations. So I think that's the simple way we can all start today.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I don't know if Larry, you wanted to add anything, but if not, like that's amazing. We've heard about so many ways, all the way from actually like in your own employment, or how you can get involved, right through to just checking that the wood that you buy is MSC certified. So do I mean what is it called? It's not MSC, is it?
FSC.
Yeah, you can tell I work well with fisheries. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Again, apologies for that slight technical glitch. And thank you very much for letting us know in the chat. That is how we know when we have issues. A massive shout out to AIM, who is doing the techie side of things, because it is not easy to juggle 5 different people. So that's fantastic. Cool. So like as we move a bit towards the end, I'd quite like to just ask you a bit more about how you came to be where you are, and perhaps if there's any tips that you have for people watching who might want to get involved, either in science at university or beyond, or in this specific area. I don't know, Laura, maybe we could start with you. How did you get where you are, and any top tips?
So I'm from Spain, and I study here my undergrad and my master, and then I look for a PhD, and it was a PhD position about forest and genetics. Like I think in my case, I had everything very clear about what I wanted to do. I was very focused in forest genetics and a little bit in bioinformatics, and I had this opportunity looking for a PhD position, and I was very lucky. I don't know, I like a lot what I'm doing, and any tip is just to say, like, maybe try and I don't know, work hard and try to do what you like to do. Yeah, I don't know.
No, I think that's really important. I mean, it's so important to do something that you enjoy, particularly if you're thinking of studying something at university. You're going to be working hard, and yeah, you don't want to be slaving away on something that you're not passionate about. So yeah, good advice. Barney Rose, maybe?
So I always knew I wanted to study plants. I used to think I wanted to study physics, and then I got some work experience in physics and realized I hated it. That's something I'd definitely say is, like, if you've got a dream in mind, that's excellent. But if you can, and obviously I was very lucky that it was possible, like, try and find out if you'd actually like the work, because just because you enjoy studying it in school doesn't necessarily mean it's the same. But then I managed to find some work as well in a plant science laboratory, and worked out that I loved that. Even the really, really boring stuff I enjoy, like if I have to count seeds for 4 hours so that I can weigh them and find something out, like I still find that interesting because I like what I'm working with and I can see the bigger picture. Went to university, studied plant science, but then I think like my takeaway would be perseverance, because I didn't get any of the PhDs I applied for my first year. I applied for like 9 PhDs and I didn't get any of them. That was like a real setback, and I wasn't in a position where I could take unpaid work or get an internship for further experience, because that wasn't my like financial position. So I went and I worked for a year and did something completely different. But during that time, like, applied for more PhDs and then got the one that I have now. But I would just say that like it can be very difficult, and I know that like people coming from different backgrounds can have incredibly different experiences. So perseverance is really key, but also, like, if you can't do it at that point, that doesn't mean that it's the end. You can take a break to do something else, and that's absolutely fine. And not to feel, as I did at the time, like I was a massive failure and I was never going to be a scientist, because like that isn't necessarily the case. Like everyone has different things that they do, and like so many like arrows to go in their bow. So I think, yeah, persevere where you can, but if you can't, like, don't worry. take a break. It's going to be okay.
Thank you. I think a lot of people will be encouraged by that. It can be really tricky. Academia is one of those environments where you have to sometimes try again, and it's not because you're not doing it right. It's just how it is. So yeah, thanks so much for that. Hayley.
So I first got into it because I was interested in conservation and thought I would want to do the policy side. And then I desperately needed a job. And so my undergrad PI at the University of Maryland, Miley Neal, gave me a job working in a genetics lab. And even though I thought I hated genetics, I immediately fell in love, especially like with what you could do with genetics. And so then I went off and got my PhD doing genetics to inform conservation in a plant species. And then on a huge whim, applied to a job at Oxford that told me I could continue to do genetics, and somehow got it, because let me tell you, if you had told me 3 years ago I'd be at the University of Oxford, I would not have believed you. So there's tip number one, never sell yourself short. You can totally, like, you will go further than you had thought you had, for sure. I would say definitely get lab experience, because I wouldn't have known that I would love doing research if I hadn't worked in a lab. And the last tip is to like continue to try things, because don't hem yourself in, like Barley Rose was saying. I didn't know if I'd like genetics. I didn't even know I'd be working in forest genetics, and now I really like this. So continue to try things, and yeah, anyone can do this. I can promise you that. It does. It takes perseverance and just trying.
Fab. And last but not least, Henry.
Well, I started my academic career in undergrad, and my first project is actually researching on population genetics of Aquilaria sinensis, also known as agarwood, and also known as the tree that gave Hong Kong its name. So it's by the age of something like 20, I first realized how trees have these sort of cultural connections with us. And as a conservation biologist, I always feel that one greatest hurdle of conserving trees or conserving in the environment is how distant we feel from the nature. We waste papers, we consume electricity, we overexploit this because we forget where they come from. We forget all the electricity comes from fossil fuels, and not all, but I mean some part of the electricity comes from fossil fuels, and in turn it actually all came back from, actually all came from the nature. And I think how we are going to connect us back to this nature, one way is science. Science is really the motivation that help us realize these connections and realize the true values of these biological organisms, these nature, these habitat. And I still remember in my personal statement when I was applying to Oxford, I wrote down something that sounds quite romantic. It's forests actually tell our history, tell the history of Earth, and tells how we become here, but it also tells our fate. It also tells where we are going to in the future. And I think in general that what leads to a good PhD or what leads to a successful career in academia is really finding that motivation and finding the passion that that's so stuck in you, and you keep thinking, and you just stay here for the sake of them. So I think, yeah, that's how I end up here.
Yeah, beautifully put. Thank you. I could sit and listen to you all just talking about this for a lot longer. I always find this every week. It's a shame that we don't have all afternoon to chat, but thank you. Those are really interesting insights. We do actually have another question come in. And it's kind of linked to, I guess, what you were just saying, and when we're chatting about how the public can get involved. Judith asks, how can we, as the uneducated public, probably being too harsh on yourself, Judith, but what can the public do to help trees adapt to their new climates? A tricky question. I'm not sure whether it's more about what we should be doing to help prevent the change in the first place, but I don't know if any of you can respond to that one.
So I think this might go back to it. So I don't know what each of us can do individually, except for going back to that thing about looking into politicians. But there are things that are being done on the government level to try to help forests adapt to the climate. And Europe is looking into it. Canada has already started. And so what they're doing is they are using genetics in order to try to match what the projected future with what's currently going on. And so they'll take a forest that is maybe more warm adapted, and they'll take seed from that forest and plant it somewhere that's cooler right now, but we know will get warmer. And this is a lot of what Henry is looking into. And so scientists are doing the work to inform government, and government is now starting to put this into place in policy. Do you have anything else to add to that, Henry?
Well, one thing that comes to mind will be especially since humans start to let's say disturb the environment, or like these human activities affect how the natural habitats look like. Actually, forest nowadays forests, especially in, I'm not very sure about the UK, but at least Hong Kong and somewhere I know, most of the places I know, the forests are no longer their original state, and many of them have introduced species, especially when during a particular time in history, for example, the last century, the government or the people just start to like bring in different new species not in their original habitat to try to boost up the forestry again, because lots of them are being locked down for tree product at some point in the past. So our forests are not necessarily healthy at this moment as its original happiest state. So one thing I will look like I have in mind is afforestation. So how we can improve our current forest. Can we restore the native biodiversity? For example, in terms of trees, can we encourage the government, or as well general citizens, can us help plant more native trees in your regions? That will do good for the natural biodiversity, because one thing bad about introduced species is they are not compatible with the original system. So for example, the birds or for example, the insects won't benefit from these exotic tree species. But if we can gradually replace these patterns and, well, as citizens using citizen science or just doing tree planting, these I think will gradually change and improve our forest in that sense.
Super interesting. And thank you. That was a great question, Judith, and thank you for sending it in. And Jacob and Gem Toes seem to enjoy your advice, saying such great advice, everyone, when you were chatting earlier. So yeah, thanks again for that. I guess we should think about wrapping up. One of the things that I kind of wanted to ask and haven't had a chance, and might be a fun place to end, is what is your fun forest or tree fact? I don't know if any of you have one prepared, but if you do, I'd love to hear them.
I've got one, and surprise, surprise, it is genetic based. So when you are looking at some of the trees that you'd see around here, specifically evergreens or conifers, like we'd say, so the genomes of these trees, so like the full genetic makeup, is actually close to 7 times greater than the size of our human genomes. So for example, use Sitka spruce, which most of you have probably seen, even though it's not native to the UK. And if you're in the US, you'll see it on the West Coast, or Canada for that matter. So the size of the Sitka spruce genome is around 20 gigabases, we say. So 20 compared to the human genome, which is 3. So that's like crazy. Like, yeah, they're big, but I wouldn't necessarily I think we think of plants as being not complex, but they are pretty complex, and their genomes show that complexity.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Thank you. Henry, do you have one off the top of your head?
I will draw one classic textbook example, which I always found fascinating about the interactions in the nature, is fig trees. So fig trees are really a big family of trees that are widespread in the world. I think, well, we have some species here in UK and of course in like different places in the world anyway. So fig trees have these mutualistic relationships with many pollinators. And one interesting story is with fig wasps. So I call it home sweet home fig wasps. So female wasp carries pollens from another fig and enters an unripe fig. And wasp pollinates the flower and lays eggs inside the fig, the fruit. So some flowers with wasp larvae form these sort of protective gauze, and some other produce seeds after pollination. And when male wasps leave the gauze and fertilize the female, they will die and remain in the fig. And the fertilized female will collect pollens and leave the figs, and this entire beautiful life cycle continues. And we can see that the figs here benefit from pollination by these fig wasps, while the fig wasps find a mating ground and also protection inside the figs to produce their offspring. So I just found this a beautiful love story you can find in nature.
Fantastic. I've come to expect nothing less from you at this point in our conversation as a romantic story about fig wasps. So thank you, Henry. I feel he might have slightly taken from you, Barley Rose, seeing as you're the insect person in the group. But do you have a different fun fact you could share with us?
Yeah, so I'll keep it pretty general, but just we think about trees, as Hayley was saying, as being not like particularly developed, like especially compared with humans and stuff, and we think like they can't move, they can't talk, they can't like communicate. So what I'm going to talk about is communication. So trees do actually communicate, and they form these huge networks with mycorrhizae, so with fungus that live underground, so like mushrooms, but the bits of mushrooms you can't see, basically. And so the roots of one tree will be connected to these fungi, and that helps because the tree gives the fungus sugar, and the fungus gives the tree nitrogen. So that's the first thing that's good about them. What's really cool is that they can communicate, and so they've done some tests on this now, but it's really amazing. So if one tree starts being attacked by insects, it sends out chemicals which are then picked up by the fungus and which are then given to the neighboring trees. So when one tree begins being attacked by insects, the other trees surrounding it before they've been attacked will begin to change what they're doing and produce more chemicals to deter these insects. So amazing. They're not even talking directly to each other. In some ways, they're being like way more sophisticated than people, because people can only talk to other people. But this is a tree talking to a fungus. That's not even the same group. It's not even still plants. It's talking to a fungus, which is then talking to another tree to like hand off this information. And I just think that's really cool. We can't like go out and begin chatting to birds. So I don't know. I think we underestimate.
I think we do. That's really cool. Thank you. Yeah, I'm learning so much just in this like last few minutes as well. Thank you. And last but not least, Lara, do you have a fact to finish on?
So I don't have a fact. I just want to say that all the things that my colleagues just said are amazing, and just to finish and to say that trees are amazing. It's amazing to be able to study them and all the interactions with other species, other animals, or other plants gives us a lot of information, which is very, very interesting always. Yeah. Absolutely. It's very important. It's very important as well to focus more in forests and trees. Research, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, that seems a fantastic point to finish on. So, we've been going on longer than usual, but it's been fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us for so much of your time this afternoon. Thank you as well for listening and for all of your brilliant questions. It's always fantastic to have this kind of interaction. So I guess the only thing for me to say is that we'll be back again next week. So at the same time next Tuesday, which is the 11th of August, we'll be joined by Dr. Annika Nupel and Dr. Karen Papier, and they're nutritional epidemiologists from the Cancer Epidemiology Unit here in Oxford. And we're going to be having a meaty conversation. So we're going to be talking all about whether eating meat is really that bad for you, and about all that kind of thing. So it should be really interesting. And I'd urge you to come along and join us again and get involved in that conversation. As I said at the start, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Oxford Sparks, and that's probably the best way that you can keep up to date on and be notified about when events like that are taking place. Thank you to Gem Toes, who's just said all really interesting, and thanks for hosting. You're very welcome. Really, really nice to have you watching, and I know that some families and friends of our interviewees watching, so special hello to all of you, and thanks for coming along. Brilliant. So thank you to all of you, and hope to see you again soon. And one more thing, if you want to keep involved and in touch with what this particular group is doing, then you can follow them on Twitter. I'm just double checking at Mackay_lab. And also you can see that we have, do you still have your Twitter handle is on the screen, Hayley. So do give them a follow, and excellent. So without any more of me yabbering on, thanks again, and stay safe, and we'll see you again next week. Bye. Bye, everybody.